November 8, 2018, Santa Clara County Finance and Government Operations Committee meeting at 2 p.m.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, let me ask that the chambers come to order, please. Thank you very much. And this is the November 8th, 2 p.m. meeting of the Finance and Government Operations Committee. We will begin with a call to order, but before we do so, let me just indicate that Supervisor Chavez has been called out of state on family matter, so we will be operating as a one committee member committee of the whole today. That means we will not be able to take formal action in the absence of a quorum, which I will announce in a moment. I will walk through how we intend to proceed in the absence of a quorum and would ask that you give that your careful attention so you understand what the disposition of your items will or won't be today. But first, just to go through the formal process, item number 1 is a call to order. Clerk of the board, please call the roll.
Supervisor Chavez is absent. Supervisor Smithian?
Present.
Do not have a quorum.
All right, thank you. We have one of the 2 committee members present, just for the record. And as I indicated a moment ago, that means we'll operate as a committee of the whole and will be unable to take formal action today. So let me share with you all how I hope to proceed so some of you can get back to other business. What I'm going to, I was going to say suggest, but since I am the only one here, I guess I get to, what I'm going to indicate is the following. I had anticipated that items number 9, 10, 13, 14, 15, and 16 would be on consent. Those are items 9, 10, 13, 14, 15, and 16. They are the TSS semi-annual report on IT projects, number 9. Number 10, the Board of Plumbing Examiners amendments to rules of procedure. And then 13, 14, 15, and 16 are all facilities and fleet issues, county parking lots, solar PV arrays, status of capital projects, and the use of real estate brokers. I would have proposed those for consent. What I will do now is simply indicate that in the absence of a quorum, we will put them on the agenda for our next meeting, which is scheduled for November the 29th, as a, quote, special consent calendar in addition to whatever other consent items we may have at that time. So on the 29th, my expectation is we'll have a consent calendar for that meeting, but we'll have a special consent calendar, which will be items that were deferred from today's meeting in the absence of a quorum. Similarly, at that time, on that same special consent calendar, my expectation is that the 3 items that I am hoping we can take up today will be continued either on consent or for discussion, and more likely for discussion now that I think about it, but for action based on the action of the board at that time. And then there are some other items that I am sure are going to require some discussion with both members of the committee, and we will defer those as well. Those items are to be deferred. So, Mr. Clerk, item 7, OES use of artificial intelligence. Item 11, fairgrounds master planning process. Item 12, the civic center master plan. All of those will be simply deferred. We will not take those up today. And we will take them up at that time. And then I'm also going to defer both items 17 and 19, which deal with election and voting security, because my understanding is we can't really have a closed session of the board or of the committee, meaning 2 members of the committee, if we only have 1 member of the committee. So I know I've tossed a lot of information out there for you all. Let me try and walk it through one more time. If you're here for item 9, 10, 13, 14, 15, or 16, those are items for consent, and in the absence of a quorum today, we'll simply continue those for a special consent calendar at our November 29th meeting. If you're here for items 7, 11, 12, OES use of artificial intelligence, fairgrounds master planning process, civic center master plan, election and voting security, 17 and 19, those items will be deferred to the next meeting. And then the 3 items, also item number 6, surveillance policies, various departments, that item will also be, forgive me, I overlooked that one, my mistake. And then the three items I'm hoping we can hear today, at least briefly, are items 4, 5, and 8. Item 4 for today is the ESA actionable reforms. Item 5 is the TSS procurement, inmate telephone services and tablets conversation, and item 8 is the management audit. So, at this time, if you're here for items 9, 10, 13, 14, 15, and 16, you have a snow day, okay? And we'll put it on the calendar for the next time. If you're here for items 7, 11, excuse me, 6, 7, 11, 12, 17, and 19, we'll be bringing those back to the next meeting. Again, feel free to step away. And then if you're here for items 4, 5, and 8, we'll hear those today as a committee of the whole, one-member committee, but we'll have to defer action in the absence of any quorum. And we do have 2 cards today as we get to item number 2, which is public comment. And public comment is that portion of our agenda set aside for comment by members of the public in the absence of an agenda item that fits your topic. This is the place. I do have 1 card, and that's Mr. Scott Largent. Mr. Largent, why don't you come on down? Welcome.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, Scott Largent. I've been busy. Let's just say that. Been very busy. Been online a lot, editing videos, making descriptions, getting new friends on the internet. YouTube is fantastic for getting things done with all the recordings I've done over the last 3 years. I'm getting great results. People are chiming in. People are putting pressure on different agencies when they look like, when they just look incompetent in these videos I'm putting up online. That's why I haven't been able to attend meetings as much, and I'm spending a lot of time getting this stuff up there. It will get results done. I'm also looking forward to Victorious coming back, and I'm really excited about that. I know you guys have really been putting the heat on him, pushing all these court appearances out, fighting his appeals. James, you guys are going to lose. I mean, you guys are really going to lose, and we're going to be rolling that red carpet out, and we're going to be letting Victorious back in here. Lynching him for bringing an inflatable gorilla was unacceptable. There were times in these meetings where I disrupted the meeting. The political outburst was me. I mean, I'd be screaming, yelling, then escorted out of here. Bless you. I'd be escorted out of here. And the funny thing is all of a sudden, your staff up here would direct the deputies to go surround Victorious. Now, Victorious wasn't doing anything wrong. So he was always kind of like the usual suspect in here, which I felt was really strange. Now, several times when I was upset and you did clear the chambers out, Joe, that was the appropriate way to do it. Now, a couple of different times I had ran into Carl and Lori Smith out there when I kind of was upset and went off in here. They didn't go get restraining orders. They didn't all of a sudden start violating my civil rights. They didn't make my life difficult for a political outburst. But for some reason, that's what you guys decided to do to Victorious. Victorious has a lot of problems with our district attorney. He wanted community justice. He was a member of Shiradash congregation in Los Gatos. And when Victorious's marriage fell apart and Judge Persky absolutely screwed him in court and sent his family was basically in Florida, Victorious was going through some really hard times. And he started working over there, doing brickwork in Los Gatos there. And Rabbi Aaron decided to kind of befriend him in a way. And well, basically what he was doing, he was seeking comfort in other people. And it was really sad what happened over there. And after he was working one day, he went in there with Rabbi Aaron into her office. And long story short, she doped up one of his drinks. Victorious passed out. He woke up the next day. It really shocked him. So he thought something was weird. Second time around, he stuck a camera up against her wall in there. And when he woke up, that video was Rabbi Aaron giving him a blowjob, and he was passed out. That congregation offered him 4 different settlements, getting all the way up to $750,000. Victorious wanted justice out of our DA's office, and he wanted Rabbi Aaron prosecuted. That's why he was originally coming here. He will be back, and he will get community justice. Thank you.
Let me just confirm with the clerk, we have no other cards under item number 2. Takes us to item number 3, which is to approve the consent calendar, which we will pass by given the absence of a quorum, and the plan to take action on those items as indicated at our next meeting. That does take us to item number 4, which is to receive the report from the Employee Services Agency relating to the 3 most actionable significant reforms to improve the hiring process. And Dr. Smith, we're going to go to Mr. Mills on this, yes?
Yes, John's going to take the lead.
Thanks. Mr. Mills. Item number 4.
Yes, thank you, Chairperson Simidian. John Mills, Employee Services Agency Director. The item before the committee is a report related to the 3 most actionable and significant reforms to improve the hiring process. This was requested in a committee discussion back in April, and we initially provided a report to the committee in August, which was held to this date to reflect a little bit of the discussion that the board had on this topic and related topics at the first board meeting in August. Just very briefly, the 3 general areas of focus that I wanted to highlight in this report. The first that I touched on is transparency. And for us, transparency is very important in terms of learning and collaboration and understanding between human resources and hiring departments, so that the recruitment process is not a quote-unquote black box to the hiring departments. And in the legislative file, I've detailed the progress that we've made on those efforts to date. Transparency sort of leads into the second area of focus that I described, which is data. We, as other operating departments do, need data to monitor progress toward our deliverables and deadlines, to hold all parties involved accountable, and to more easily manage our workload. This fiscal year, we've been able to add some analytical staff in ESA who've been able to help us with some of our data collection and analysis, but our challenge to date has been technology. Our data collection and analysis processes are all manual, and ESA currently doesn't have dedicated IT staff embedded within the agency as some other departments do. But we are working on this with TSS and hope to have some dedicated resources alongside us to help us with our approved technology projects, some of which I've described here in the legislative file that are specifically aimed towards supporting recruitment, including our recruitment dashboard, our classification plan database, and our onboarding module. And then the third area that I discussed in the report is what we are referring to as our Candidate Experience Initiative, which is basically our initiative to get hiring departments to commit to mapping the recruitment schedule up front so that candidates do not perceive any delays in the steps of the process. And finally, I used the opportunity of providing this report to just provide a very brief overview and highlights of the ESA organizational transformation effort that we just kicked off in collaboration with the Stanford Center for Leadership and Transformation. This is an organization-wide effort that involves all ESA departments, but there is a specific focus on human resources, which will also include engaging an outside consultant with public sector HR expertise who can help us with benchmarking and best practices. And with that, I'll stop my overview and I'm available for any questions or comments.
Thank you. It's unfortunate Supervisor Chavez isn't here, so she could tease me about on the one hand, on the other hand, because I'm about to go there. On the one hand, I found the report very helpful, in the laying out of the sort of the 3 major pathways that you have described, as well as the CLT effort, and I really do see them as sort of large systemic undertakings, and want to sort of give you a nod of recognition and appreciation for that. On the other hand, what I think we were asking for, what I know I was asking for, was okay, enough with the big picture process stuff. Are there 3 things we could do that, if I want to improve your fuel efficiency, I know that if I go out and check the tire and make sure you got the right amount of pressure in each tire, that's going to improve your fuel efficiency. That's a thing that's going to do it. I know that it is. If I get you to stop speeding and go at a more sensible speed, I know that that's going to improve your fuel efficiency. I know that it is. What I'm trying to get to here is, are there 3 things we can say, you know what? For years and years, we continue to have people concerned about how long it takes and how tough it is to fill these positions. Are there 3 things we can do that will make it better, that are not so big picture, not so abstract, not so systemic, but that are sort of immediate quick fixes? Given the depth and breadth of the problem, I cling to the notion that there have to be at least a few things that fit that description. Your thoughts?
A few things that would fit that description. But I think to your point about that it's a systemic issue with a long history, and in my observation and estimation, there's a lot of sort of county organizational culture aspects that play into it, that even if there were a handful of quick fixes that we might sort of throw at that environment, this sort of systemic issue would remain. And I know it's not the easy or sort of most efficient approach, but I think in the end it's going to be the most effective approach to sort of take the big picture wholesale step and sort of bring everyone along with us.
I'm biting my tongue, Mr. Mills. I appreciate that. I don't disagree with any of it. I'm going to ask you to come back at the meeting on the 29th with something that is responsive to the request in a more specific, tangible, and immediate way. I'm going to ask the county executive to work with you in that regard. I'm not asking you to change the world overnight. I get that. I am asking you to say, you know what? Here are 3 things we ought to just go fix, and let's just go fix them. And I appreciate the efforts towards making sure we have better data and more transparency, and that we've mapped out a good experience for the candidate. But given the very size and scope and complexity of this, I got to believe that there are a few places where if somebody were just to tell it like it is and step up and say, you know what, this piece has been broken forever and we ought to just fix it, and we ought to fix it. And that's kind of what you're hearing is 6 years worth of frustration, and I'd like to see if we can't find a way to improve the process for everybody in the organization. Dr. Smith, I see you leaning in.
We'll come back with some suggestions that could be done. As you well know, having been in politics for a long time, a lot of the things that cause problems in a political organization are things that previous political entities have put into them because of other priorities. So a lot of what we're going to suggest to you is changes in the MOU of many different departments and many different contracts, because we've tied our hands inappropriately and unnecessarily by limiting our management discretion in a number of ways. So that'll be there, and it'll be something that could be done quickly. I leave it to you to decide whether politically it's acceptable.
Fair enough, and that's what I'm looking to see. And if we make the judgment as a committee or a board that one recommended solution or another simply isn't going to be palatable, practicable, whatever, fair enough. But
we'll do
since we're having the conversation, I'm going to go to a place I didn't think I was going to go today, which is 10th floor. And Mr. Mills, here's the good news. This has nothing to do with you. Nothing. Except it's a metaphor. Sink is stopped up in the restroom. Okay. Somebody slaps up a notice, job order placed such and such a day. Drip, drip, drip. Dirty water congregating. No one using the sink. They can't use the sink, they can't wash their hands after they've been to the restroom, so no one's using the restroom. Drip, drip, drip. Keep stacking up. Job order placed. A day goes by, a week goes by, 2 weeks goes by. Speculation runs rampant on the 10th floor. Should somebody bring a can of Drano in and take the matters into their own hands, literally? And ultimately, it gets fixed. Now you're thinking to yourself, really? If that's what it takes to get a sink unstopped on the 10th floor, where are we in this organization with stuff that's really much more important to more people and affects their daily lives? And, you know, we had that conversation around ESA, we had the conversation around the CAN Center to get serious again. You know, you will recall that when Supervisor Chavez and I came to work here 6 years ago, pretty close to the same time, 59% of the calls were being answered, which is another way of saying 41% of the calls weren't being answered on a timely basis. So now I'm back into the ESA arena. I'm not laying that at your doorstep. I know that's before your time. But what I'm saying is, essentially what we did was we sat in this committee and Supervisor Chavez's Children, Seniors, and Families Committee and said, we're not letting this one go until the problem gets solved, because we can't have a system where 41% of the calls don't get answered on a timely basis when people are really at risk. And, you know, we confronted those systemic challenges, and ultimately they were fixed, and we got ourselves up to 99%, and it's a doable thing. And so, you know, after, you know, 6 years of being here and saying, can't we make this system work better, I very much appreciate it, and I want to close on this positive note. The systemic things that you put in your memo that you're trying to tackle in the hopes that those big picture fixes will have big picture long-term payoff. But again, I got to believe there are some things that if we would just confront the problem, I don't know why we still live in a world where it takes 2 weeks to clear a sink, or more importantly, by dramatic measure, we think 59% of the phone calls getting answered is an acceptable standard. But we got to do better, and there's got to be a way to do better. And so I'm imploring you to help us find that way. Okay? So we'll see you on the 29th. Anything else you want to ask or share today?
No, just the last thought that I would add is I'm sure you can imagine and appreciate that this request from the committee, and even predating the request from the committee, this topic of sort of what can we do to improve things, even if it's issues kind of beyond our control, to Dr. Smith's point. We've had lots of conversations about that, and we even had sort of various versions of this report that sort of are the bigger picture, long-term systemic approach versus sort of more what are the more sort of itemized things that you're referencing. So absolutely we can come back on the 29th with some of those things just to surface them and have the conversation.
Yeah, and I wholly take the point Dr. Smith is making, which is, you know, it may mean you have to take a deep breath, or, you know, shoulder the responsibility to make a change that's not going to be immediately and fully well received. Fair enough. That's an expectation that it's appropriate to place on the board. That being said, please don't bring us the, you know, close down the Statue of Liberty on the 4th of July kinds of choices when that's really not what we're looking for. We're looking for stuff that's real, that's practical, and that could be done if only we would do the right thing as you see it. Okay? Dr. Smith, thank you for that, and thank you, Mr. Mills. And we'll continue this item to our meeting on November the 29th, when we look forward to following up the conversation from today. Okay? Thanks. That takes us to item number 5, which is the Inmate Phone Services Report. And we've got a report from Ann Duncan. And I see we've got folks from the Sheriff's Department who are here. If they'd like to participate, we certainly want to welcome them up as well. Ms. Duncan, what would you like us to know, or in this case, me and the rest of the room to know, I guess?
Supervisor, I think, what we want you to know is in the report. We wanted to respond to your questions from the last meeting, so we would be open for questions from you at this point.
Sure. Let me just tee up a couple of quick observations and then ask people what they think. Can you introduce who's at your table, please, and then we'll ask the folks over here to introduce themselves since I've welcomed them up without introducing them, please.
Sure. I'm Ann Duncan. I'm the Chief Information Officer for the county.
Dan Baldry, IT Director of TSS for Public Safety and Justice.
Andrew Zavoyski, Director, OCCM.
Juan Gallardo, Admin Services Director, Sheriff's Office.
And I'm going to ask people to see if they can leave their acronyms at home as we go through the rest of the introductions today.
I'm Fletcher Dobbs, Program Manager 2 in the Sheriff's Administration.
Thank you.
Lieutenant Mark Padgett, Assistant Division Commander of the main jail.
What was the last part again?
Assistant Division Commander at the main jail.
At the main jail. Thank you all very much. Okay. And I won't say Joe Simidian from FGOC. I'll say Finance and Government Operations Committee. Here's what I concluded from the report. As we've had this ongoing conversation about the telephone services availability and cost in our jails, over the course of 6 years, we have moved, I think, from what was essentially a profit-generating exercise both for the vendor but also for the county, who then turned around and used the, quote, profit to go into the inmate welfare fund, to a model where we're now, I think, looking to be revenue neutral. Am I remembering this all correctly? Good. And Ms. Duncan, thank you to you and your colleagues. The question was, well, New York City has recently moved to a let's just make it free approach. And I did find it interesting that they make, quote, domestic telephone service free. And then the question is, what does that entail? And do I gather correctly that it's everybody's understanding that domestic in their case means not just what we would call local calls, but also statewide calls and even interstate calls, but not international calls? Is that what everybody is understanding? Mr. Dobbs, I see you the most energetically engaged, so let me ask you, is that your understanding?
That's my understanding, yes.
Ms. Duncan, is that consistent with what you've got? Okay.
That's our understanding.
All right. And are there any understanding that you've also got a wide range here of $800,000 to $1.5 million in additional costs if we went that route? Are there any administrative savings from not having to have a collection infrastructure? One of the things I've noticed as we've had this conversation over 6 years is, if you're going to charge people money for a service, then you have to set up at least some kind of modest bureaucracy. And I don't mean bureaucracy in a bad way. I just mean you need to have some kind of a modest bureaucracy to collect the money, keep track of the money, account for the money, send the money to the right place. I see somebody leaning in, so yes, go ahead.
Would you say that is a correct assumption?
Do we know roughly how much money we're talking about that we could cost avoidance? I'm trying to figure out I know what the cost of $800,000 to $1.5 million is. That's $800,000 to $1.5 million. I'm trying to figure out what the cost avoidance, if any, might be.
I couldn't be able to, comment on that.
Dan.
Please.
So I'll defer to the Sheriff's Office in terms of how the commissary system is handled, but my understanding in terms of cost savings or cost avoidance through making these free phone calls, I'm not under the impression that there's significant cost savings associated with that. Juan or Fletcher, you want to add to that?
Would we still have to have the accounting bureaucracy in place for international calls, for example? Because I know that many of our inmates make international calls, or at least I understand that they do, if I'm correct in that.
I actually think you could structure the contract such that the vendor would absorb any cost to administer those international phone calls.
And do we have that administrative cost / bureaucracy in place still for the commissary, so that to the point about what cost avoidance we might or might not achieve?
Today, there's no revenue stream to the county for either telephone calls or commissary.
Okay. And the commissary vendor absorbs the accounting costs because the money just goes to the vendor now that we've stopped taking a piece of the action, yes?
Yes, sir.
Great, thank you. It's some of this is a little old in terms of how long it's been since we've talked about it. So let me toss out a sort of a philosophical view, and I'm going to turn to the county exec here in a minute and get his take on it as well. And if the sheriff's department has I think, and we do have a card from a member of the public who I'm going to get to in a minute. I think we've talked about the first round of conversations on this issue of telephone costs had to do, in my view, I guess I should make that observation, in my view, had to do with the fact that I thought we were charging excessive amounts in a way that was not justifiable. And different people have a different point of view about that, fair enough. So what I was pushing for initially was, let's get to a revenue neutral place where we let people make phone calls, but it's not a profit center for our operation. And that's where we are headed if we're not fully there yet. But that's, I think, the current understanding and expectation. We realized that that meant that there would be revenues we no longer received. Those revenues could no longer go into the inmate wealth fund. That would be a cost to the general fund of the county, and we've had that conversation. Revenue neutral makes sense if you are, again, in my judgment, if you're neutral about the impact. We've also had some conversations, though, about the importance of making sure folks in the system stay connected to friends and family and the community, and that we see that as not a neutral, but actually a net plus. Now, I've had some folks who push back and say, well, you may think that's the benign good purpose that those phone calls are for, but some people are still trying to run a criminal enterprise over your telephone system. Don't kid yourself about that. So I guess I would ask folks from the Sheriff's Department, if we said, let's just put the cost aside for a minute. If we said, you know what, we're just going to make it free, and people are going to presumably make more telephone calls, which everybody has said they think. Is that a good thing, a bad thing, or a no big deal one way or the other thing in terms of recidivism, staying connected to the community? Any thoughts?
I would say, to add on to that question, one component that should be considered is the fact that we're deploying tablets in the jails. And so now you would have an exponential way to have inmates communicate with family members. And so with those two factors, you could really connect nearly every inmate and provide them that ability, both from hardwired telephones to tablets.
So you're asking me, or asking us, to be mindful of the fact that the question comes in the context of a larger effort to connect folks in the correctional system with folks in the community. Do we really think that's going to pay off, is my question. If you had to offer best professional judgment, or is it just going to be a nice to have, but not really a benefit in terms of either the potential for recidivism, the ability to reconnect people in their communities upon reentry, the desire to keep people nonviolent while they're in custody so that we keep our staff safe as well as other inmates? What's your take, Lieutenant?
Well, I think the tablets would provide quite a bit of an advantage to the sheriff's office as well as to the inmate population. It would definitely increase the communication they have with their friends and family who they don't get to see on a regular basis. It would provide off-time hours to communicate with them. We currently have a visiting system where we're bound by hours. The tablets may provide another alternative to them where families who work don't have to try to schedule time off to work to communicate and see their loved ones. Also, the educational programs and services that could be provided on the tablets, I think, is endless. I think you could do self-paced instruction. You could do life skills education, and you made reference to reentry, as far as some reentry skills in there that they can participate in prior to them going back into the society. I think you also have access to facility forms at their fingertips that we wouldn't have to have staff provide to them, such as grievance forms, request forms, commissary order forms, commissary menus, inmate rule books, and we could also communicate with thousands of inmates with, in a sense, the touch of a button if you needed to push some type of alerts or mass information distribution. So I think the benefit of having the tablets in a correctional system is huge.
Thank you. And just, I should acknowledge I have been more focused over the years myself on the telephones. I think Supervisor Chavez has been more focused on the tablets. So together we've been a complete package on this pair of issues. We do have a couple of cards. I'd like to take them first from Ron Hansen and then Christine Clifford on this item. So if you two would like to come up to the microphone, we've set aside 2 minutes, and then I'm going to ask Dr. Smith to get his take as well. So.
Good afternoon, Supervisor and committee members. I'm Ron Hansen. I'm affiliated with PACT, People Acting in Community Together. In reading this report, one may easily conclude that it would be prohibitively expensive, maybe $1.5 million annually, to provide free phone calls to those in our jails. As has been mentioned just now, there is ample evidence that shows that those who can maintain a consistent and supportive family contact during their incarceration will have better outcomes upon release than those who don't or cannot have that contact. This report suggests that there are two options: either provide free phone calls with its prohibitive expense or don't. I submit that there are, as you have mentioned, other options here. For example, instead of an all or nothing approach, one could consider a limited number of free calls per person, thereby encouraging contact while still minimizing the financial impact to our county. Another, perhaps more robust option, as has been referred to here, is to look at contact in a broader context. In addition to phone calls, inmate contact could be maintained through texts or other electronic means, namely email or video chat. If one looks at several tablet systems, as I have, nearly all have mastered secure texting, email, and video chat, all while operating in a secure jail environment. One more reason to focus on moving tablet implementation in our jail across the finish line as quickly as we can. I encourage this committee, as well as the Office of the Sheriff and the Procurement and TSS departments, to not limit our vision to an all or nothing solution to improving and enhancing contact options for those in our jail. I hope that this report is the beginning and not the end of this conversation. Broadening our options will certainly benefit us all. Thank you.
Ms. Clifford?
Hi, Christine Clifford with PACT in Silicon Valley Debug. I just want to make two quick comments. So when you're using GTL to make phone calls, you make a deposit on your own account so that the person inside can call out to you. GTL put a cap on the amount of money that you can put on each time you make a transaction. So you can put $50 at a time on. So every time you put on $50, you're charged $4 and something cents. So rather than you being able, so there's an innate sort of system there for the GTL to continue to make some money off of people in some manner that when you put money on your phone, because every time that $50 comes up, you have to put more on. So it's a recurring cost. There's not a max. You can't put on hundreds of dollars. So for some families, that's a burden. The other thing is, in Debug, we work with a lot of people inside who are trying to reach out to other agencies. We have a gentleman we're working with now. He's trying to get some help with maintaining custody of his child while he's incarcerated. He has a release date in 2020, but the courts are inching up on having his child put up for adoption, and he's trying to reach out to a group that helps inmates work on how they can best present themselves in a court setting to give an argument for why they should be able to maintain custody of their child. And he doesn't have a card phone. He can't call these people. They don't collect calls. So if he had an opportunity for access to be able to reach out to these agencies, people like him would have a better opportunity to make connections with the kinds of resources that they're looking for out in the community that'll make them more successful people when they return to us. So that's, for me, another reason for you to look at no-cost phone calls. Thank you.
Ms. Tompkinson, do I understand you got a client in the audience who is actually part of the New York experience? I do. Why don't I ask him to come on up, share a couple of thoughts, and forgive me, I don't have your name, but we'll have you fill out a card. And what I'm going to do, since it's a little out of the ordinary, is I'm going to just exhort you not to do a sales pitch, but I think if we've got someone who's got some experience with the New York model, we might as well ask if you've got anything you want to share with us based on the questions or comments I've already made.
Could we also add the caveat that my client is in an open RFP process. He is a proposer.
Great.
So we wouldn't want to do anything to jeopardize that
So
relationship.
let me ask the county council if we can find a way to make this work. Mr. Williams, if I ask, tell me your name again, sir.
Dave Jorgensen with Securus. If you ask,
Thanks.
maybe
No, if you, Mr. Jorgensen, if you'll step over there, there is a microphone, even though it's invisible.
Sorry.
And Mr. Williams, my question is, if I ask him, what's your experience in New York, am I allowed to do that without botching the entire RFP process?
Yeah, I think it's fine for him to comment generally on what is happening in New York without talking about what is being proposed here or what products you'd be offering to Santa Clara County.
And I know I'm putting you both on the spot, but since I got the reference and the mention when I walked in, I thought, let's take advantage of it while we got it. You're okay with it as long as we limit it to that, Mr. Williams? I want to stay well inside the lines.
Yeah, so I would just caution you to be conservative in your comments.
All right.
Understood. We've been servicing New York or Rikers Island for about 2 years now. Recently, they did put in a request for the county to pay for the inmate telephone calls versus the way that they had been doing it prior, which is similar to pretty much everywhere throughout the country. The city is going to pay directly to Securus the cost of the calls, and how specific would you like me to be here?
So, and did they have some, and what's your understanding of the reason they chose to do that?
A lot of the things that were mentioned earlier, keeping those communication ties to loved ones, to family, so forth. There's proven studies that the more contact they have with the outside, the better they are when they get outside. And that was the big driving force behind that, as well as being able to, a lot of times inmates can't make a phone call when they get in jail because nobody has an account or they're not able to reach a loved one. This completely eliminates that barrier. As soon as they get incarcerated, they can make a phone call to whoever they're allowed to make the calls to.
And is the conversation we had about the term of art a domestic call consistent with your understanding that a domestic call is anywhere in the United States?
That is correct, sir.
And just out of curiosity, how do we avoid, quote, potential abuse of somebody calling up every ex-girlfriend or boyfriend across the United States of America and just shooting the breeze for 30 minutes at a stretch?
There's ways that we can solve that. I don't want to get into the sales pitch aspect of it, but there are ways to prohibit that. The gentleman mentioned potentially limiting the amount of free calls per week. So there's a lot of different ways that we can approach that depending on what the county and the sheriff's department goals would be.
All right. I'm going to say thank you very much, and before anybody gets in trouble, let you take your seat again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Then going back to the staff, we are on the Fourth Amendment to the agreement we currently have, yes. And then we approved a Fifth Amendment for 8 months while we complete the contract negotiations and implementation of the new telephone system and tablet services for the jail system. Do I have that part right?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Thank you. And that's the one for which the RFP is currently open that we were just discussing?
Yes, that's correct.
And could you remind me at least how long that one is expected to run?
I'm not sure of your question, sir.
I'm sorry if I was unclear. So there's an RFP out there for someone to provide services from when to when? Over what period of time?
The term of that agreement will be negotiated.
Okay. So thank you. That's I should have just been more direct and asked you because what I was getting at was if we decide to go down a different path, we could do that for some limited period of time while we saw how we liked that rather than a longer period of time that locked us into something that might be a new approach. Yes, no, maybe, somebody?
Yeah, I would just say that we're in the middle of the solicitation, selecting a vendor, and the reason for the additional time is related to the tablet project and the absence of a Wi-Fi network. And so.
But as you're in that process, have you nailed down a specific length of term for service or not yet?
Specific length of term for service for the existing vendor?
No, for the do you have an RFP out for after the Fifth Amendment?
Yes.
That's what I thought.
Yep.
And I'm going to ask you for how long is that term of service? And I thought what I heard you say is to be determined.
Correct. That is correct, sir.
Okay. So now what I'm asking you is if it's to be determined, is there a possibility that rather than have it be for a longer period of time, which we might ordinarily like so we have some certainty and we know what we're doing and we're not in here talking to the board every 15 minutes, we say we could do it for a shorter period of time if we were going to change direction on the compensation system and evaluate how that worked?
Sure, that's always an option. And I would just say that the only nuance to that is that phone rates alone will have an impact on tablet rates. And so because this is a dual project, one will have an impact on the other. And so there could be potential issues if that changed in the future.
Got it. So just understand that I'm acting or talking about the potential rather to act in a way that is interconnected, and the action in one arena will have implications for the other. Yes? Sure. Got it. Dr. Smith, you're fortunately always available to remind us that money is not inexhaustible, which I appreciate for what it's worth. But your thoughts about the cost trade-offs here and the policy implications and possible ways we might proceed if this was of interest to more than one board member?
I'll start with a hopefully humorous approach. Okay. We've spent more than $1 million talking about it, so I'd be happy to pay for it out of the general fund and give everybody free access to phones, put reasonable restrictions that custody believes are necessary in terms of content and number of calls and those things, so that they don't do something that compromises the legal situation, like calling their gang friends or calling girlfriends in Europe 10 times a day. But in terms of generating money from an outside vendor, I don't think that's necessary.
And what kind of timeline might we be looking at if we wanted to pursue that possibility? So I've got, and I apologize because I clearly communicated this earlier in a way that was confusing, so let me see if I can do better my second round. We're working on our Fifth Amendment, yes?
The Fifth Amendment extended the current agreement through July.
And I apologize again because I did say it in a confusing way. I meant as we are currently doing our work, we are doing our work based on the criteria that was contained in the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment is in place, and whatever it is we're doing pursuant to the Fifth Amendment? Yes? No?
If your question is pursuant to the Fifth Amendment today, yes.
Okay, great. So we're trying to get the RFP done for the new system before the Fifth Amendment term expires.
Correct.
All right, I'm finally getting us on the same track here. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
And so if we wanted to fold in the considerations that I've raised and that Dr. Smith has spoken to as part of this RFP process, how might that best be done? What do you need, if anything, from the board? Or is the expression of interest enough for you to go back and craft a proposal to bring to the board for a decision in final form? I want to make sure we don't lose this in the process.
Much like we did with the commissary and the current vendor, when the board abolished commissions, we would bring the contract with specific options for the board to contemplate and vote on.
I think if you can do that without it becoming too cumbersome or confusing for all the parties, that's probably a wise way to go forward, to say, if you want to pay X, here's what you can get. If you want to pay a little less, here's what you would get. If you want to pay a little less still, here's what you would get. I don't know whether it's 2 choices or 4 choices or 3 choices, but I think that would be a good way to go. I'll just add to what Dr. Smith said. In closed session, I sit and see what our settlements are for litigation that's brought when there's an incident in the jail. And, you only have to avoid one incident in the jail and a pretty significant payout to pay the cost of this stuff. I mean, it's never mind right, wrong, good, bad, good policy, bad policy from a purely financial standpoint. If we can avoid an unfortunate incident and a subsequent expensive settlement, I think this will have paid for itself. If Gary Graves were still sitting here, he would remind me that it's not cashable savings, and I'll take that to heart, but it's still real money in my judgment. I see you leaning in, sir. Are you poised? No, you're not leaning in. You're just looking engaged. That's good. All right, thank you. All right. There you go. Thank you. Well, then I'll talk directly into the microphone. My apologies. Anything else that the team here needs? Dr. Smith, what I'm going to do then is I am going to continue this item to the 29th because I know Supervisor Chavez has an interest in the issue, and I want to give her an opportunity to weigh in as well. What I'm going to do is communicate today, so I don't have to do it again on the 29th, that I would like to see us explore the possibility of going to something that looks, I'm going to call it more like the New York model or more like a no-cost model. I think ultimately that's a benefit to all parties concerned. I understand that it comes with a cost to the county and the taxpayers, but I'd like to see a look at whether or not we might not make that work. And I do want to ask you to be mindful as you think about it and or deal with your vendors to think about what kind of appropriate constraints might be put there to avoid abuse or somebody hogging the telephone, for lack of a more refined term. Okay. Any last comments or questions? Anybody there?
Or hogging the tablet.
Hogging the tablet. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me that the two are inexorably interwoven. Thank you to the members of the public who spoke. All right. Thank you all very much. I think that completes item 5 for today, and we'll simply continue the item, as I said, to our meeting on the 29th. And then the only other item that we're in a position to take up today is item number 8, which is we're at the 1-year point on the audit at TSS, which I keep calling ISD, which I'm sure I'll get over at some point. Welcome. And Ms. Sullivan, thank you for your work at the Rose Organization on this. We have what I'm pleased to say are what I'd call a relatively small number of places where there is a partial agreement, which is also another way of saying partial disagreement. Ms. Duncan, would you reintroduce yourself for the record and introduce the folks who are seated to your left, my right?
I'm Ann Duncan. I'm the Chief Information Officer for the county.
And I'm Joyce Wallace. I'm the Chief IT Business Officer.
Justin Dietrich, Chief Information Security Officer.
Thank you. And Dr. Smith, I'm going to ask you to help sort through a couple of these things, so I just wanted to give you fair warning as we go. We have items 2.2, 2.5, 3.3, 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, 5.7, and 6.1 and 6.2, I believe, is areas where there is partial agreement and thus partial disagreement. What I want to do is try and walk through these, have a little back and forth between and among the parties. Please feel free to just lean in, think of this as a little more conversational, a little less, back and forth, and forgive me if I interrupt you, and I will forgive you if you interrupt me, truly. So just let's talk it through. The first item I mentioned is, and the first couple actually, I'm particularly engaged in because of the topic. 2.2 says the recommendation from the management audit team, and this was a year ago, Ms. Sullivan, if I remember correctly, if I understand this, yes, is create additional cybersecurity positions, and then it references one, this is my packet, page 185, for those who are using the packet, one information security risk analyst manager, one information security engineer manager, and 2 IT security auditors, and then so on and so forth. Then the ISD response says, well, partially agree, but notes the CISO team is continually expanding, but some positions remain unfilled. ISD recommends filling those existing openings before creating 4 new positions. And then under the current status, it says 4 positions were funded for fiscal year 18, which I assume means last budget year?
No, I believe, Supervisor, I believe that's this current budget year. It's 18-19. Is that correct?
Okay. So, I get tripped up by that all the time. So So we're really talking about fiscal year 19, meaning the current budget year in which we sit. And it mentions what those are. And then it says that one of them, the security engineer position, has already been posted and closed, and interviews will commence shortly. 2 other roles are planned to be reviewed and posted within the next 3 to 6 months. Mr. Dietrich, you got any observations about all this? And let me just tell you my strongly held opinion, which won't come as a surprise. My feeling is if this is a priority, which for me it is, meaning cybersecurity in our organization, and if it always takes us too long to fill these positions, and it always does, then shouldn't we start sooner rather than later on the theory that the chances of anything happening too quickly are pretty darn slim? That's my pitch.
Sure. So right now, we've already hired an additional staff member, junior member.
And that's one of the 4 people that is referenced here, yes?
Correct.
Okay.
And then we have the security engineer. Actually, I think we'll be able to start interviewing within the next week or so. And then the other 2 positions are a little bit trickier because there's not a specific security auditor position or security auditor manager. So working with ESA and every other process I need to do to get an actual position description to hire to is going to be where the delay is, I believe.
Yeah, so those 2 positions would be provided as part of ITCC. The new job descriptions will become available when ITCC comes to you and gets approved.
Your most realistic assessment of how long that will take is what, Ms. Duncan?
We would hope to have it for you to approve in either a late February or an early March board meeting. We've entered the meet and confer process with the bargaining units now.
Dr. Smith, your thoughts? I mean, it is a year since the audit, and we're talking, and I'm not worried about blame, fault. I'm just saying it's a year since the audit, and now we're talking another 4 or 5 months realistically, which falls right in between 3 and 6 months, which is what the report says. And I'm just worried that if this reclass conversation becomes even more challenging and prolonged, that these positions will be held up. So thoughts about that?
My thought would be that the recommendation should be focused on the activity needed, not upon the name of the classification, because class studies take inordinately long because they're subject to meet and confer. And it would be better to say we need 2 people doing security auditing rather than to say you need a new classification. That would be my suggestion.
Ms. Solov, your thoughts? If my goal or our goal as a board/committee is to make sure that these, to the county exec's point, that these functions are being performed by people as soon as possible, thoughts about how we might do that given the classification tangle?
I don't think our concern was what we would call the positions. It was more trying to get them here to do the work. So if there's a better way to expedite that process, if we call them something else.
That being said, if we hire 2 people in the wrong classification, are we then going to have to go through a reclassification exercise for them in 6 months?
What I would suggest is while we're doing the classification study, we can hire outside contracting to do the auditor process.
I would agree with Dr. Smith that what we give you a slightly bigger picture we've been doing is we've taken all the existing openings, either whether there's an opening or a salary reserve, and we've matched those to existing positions that will map to the future state. Where we can't map to the future state because we don't have a position that does that work, we have gone with hiring contractors. That's been our approach to solve this problem, and I would suggest that's the right approach for this one as well.
Yeah, that's the quickest approach to get the job done.
Mr. Dietrich, you want to put your head in the middle of this firing match here? Is that?
No, I agree. Certainly is the quickest option. And we, I think I worked with Joyce a little bit on trying to see if there was any other classification that would work. And I think we we found like an IT auditor, but I mean, the pay range and the job description was just too much of a delta. So that's when we kind of said, well, we need to kind of either wait for IT Career Compass or rewrite it right now. And I think we agreed we should wait for IT Career Compass. But if the need is, we need to get the contractors on it.
Well, I know I'm putting you in a tough spot, and I'm doing that on purpose, just to be clear. I've got a year-old recommendation, which is why we do these one-year status reports. If you said to me, as one member of the board, and that's all I am, one member of the board, if you said to me, you know what, I appreciate the fact that you're trying to help us get this function squared away, but it's going to be more disruption to hire a contractor and then to hire somebody 5-6 months from now, I just as soon wait, I would be persuaded by that. If, on the other hand, you said to me, Supervisor, we really could make good use of some contract help until we get these jobs filled, and we don't really know for sure when we're going to get them filled, that would be fine with me too. So what's your thinking, spur of the moment here?
Well, in the very recent past, we've reached out to get some contract resources, and the information security engineering pool has been fairly slim on the contract side, especially architects. So I think it would be worth at least seeing what's out there, and if nothing there's nothing that we can just grab and get the boots on the ground and start helping us, then putting the attention to making sure we get a full-time classification.
All right, well then I think what I'm going to do is, this item is coming back on the 29th because it's the larger issue is an issue that Supervisor Chavez, I know, wants to weigh in. I'm going to ask you to give that a little attention between now and then and report back at the time. I very much appreciate the county executive's point, which I think is well taken, which is, let's not get hung up on the classification. Let's just make sure that the work gets done somehow. So why don't we ask you to explore whether or not the work could get done that way, in a way that enhances rather than disrupts the progress you're trying to make, and we'll hear back from you then. Ms. Sola, does that work for you as a way to find some common ground? Yep. And then on, yes, Dr. Smith?
Just one little additional comment, just so that everybody has it in their mind. If it's difficult to find these individuals in a contract model, it'll be even more difficult to find them in an employee model. So I really think that moving towards the contract model vigorously is a better, more rapid solution than relying on employment.
All right, Ms. Duncan and Mr. Dietrich, I think that was a subtle hint, and we'll take it, okay? And we'll hear back from you on the 29th. That takes us to item 2.5, which is the recommendation is to direct the Chief Information Security Officer to establish procedures directing all county departments and agencies to report security incidents, to the Chief Information Security Officer. The ISD response is partially agreed. It says the CISO team will work with ISD to establish security incident reporting procedures. And then when we look at the current status, it indicates that the updates to the incident response plan are scheduled to be completed by June 2019. Now, that's going to be more than a year and a half to establish some security incident reporting procedures. Does it really take that long?
I guess the biggest question that my team had is we wanted to make sure that we did have everything, I guess, in order before we had something kind of set in stone and everybody followed this process and procedure. So we do have an incident response plan today, and for the most part, everybody does certainly reach out to us for security incidents.
And you are always very kind about saying thank you when we send our phishing reports to you. So
yes, I do appreciate those. You definitely get your fair share. So I guess the bottom line is, as far as process goes, I mean, if we don't, maybe we don't even need to update our incident response plan. We just need to say, everybody report your incidents to us. I guess maybe we're even a little unclear as how exactly to go about that, aside from updating the plans. So,
Ms. Soloff, I'm going to try and broker a little get to yes here real quickly. If we ask Mr. Dietrich and or the rest of the team here to be in touch with you, I mean, candidly, my take on all this is that the management audit team is, in this case, better at finding problems than articulating the solutions. And I don't mean that critically. I mean it that that's what a good management audit team will do. On the other hand, you'd hope that the people who have the expertise would be the ones best equipped to find the solutions once the problem's been identified. And I think that's going to be the case, and that's a good thing. That being said, in this case, I just think it's a process issue. And the question is, could we find the bandwidth to say, why don't you all talk to each other and have this done by the 1st of January rather than June of 2019? Is that a doable thing?
I believe, Supervisor, we can resolve this. There's a lot of demands on Mr. Dietrich's team, and we'll help him figure out how to get this done.
All right. Well, thank you. I would appreciate that. I just think, you know, when you want something from somebody, you need to be able to make it easy for them to give it to you. You want people to report, so it needs to be easy and easily understandable. And I think what may be easy and easy to understand to the professionals is perhaps not as easy and easy to understand to the non-professionals. And Mr. Dietrich, I know that we've been throwing a lot of things your way, including the election security issues, so I don't want that to go uncommented upon. But I do think saying we're going to wait another 8 months would be unwise. Yes, Dr. Smith?
I would suggest that we address this by asking our administrative policy team to modify the current incident reporting systems to have a specific call out for IT-related security incidents. We have format and forms and reporting structure and relatively small modifications of that, I think could solve the problem. We don't need to recreate an entire new policy is what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
We just didn't need to emphasize that security incidents are specific and should be included in the reporting process.
And do we think that that's all doable on the timeline I just described by end of the year?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Then on 3.3, long recommendation, I won't repeat it all, but basically direct staff to shorten recruitment timelines by taking the following actions, of which there are then about a half dozen. And the administration's response is partially agree, but ISD, as it is known back in the day, then says, well, we think our problems are really with ESA practices, so of course we have to drag poor Mr. Mills back into the mix at that point. Thoughts about how we could make a little more progress on this one?
So, Supervisor, I actually think we are making progress with ESA on this. We've, the lean exercise certainly illuminated some opportunities for us all to work together. We continue to have work to do, right? There are some opportunities, as Mr. Mills mentioned earlier this afternoon, in terms of helping him get better data about his process that we're going to work together on by getting some staff assigned to work in a dedicated manner with his team. So, I think giving the team an opportunity to implement some of the work that they've already done in terms of planning will help us make some progress. And as I've mentioned before, we have been a distraction to them from hiring by asking them to work on ITCC in the last few months. So we want to recognize that we have been dividing their bandwidth on that as well.
Got it. So, thoughts about how we make more progress, better progress, or are we going to say we think we're doing as well as can be done and that's an acceptable standard? Ms. Soul, if you got any thoughts on this one?
Sorry. I was just saying, I think Joyce was sort of reminding me that implementing ITCC will help because we'll have better job descriptions and appropriate salaries to hire against. But I think that short of removing some of the structural barriers, we are getting to the best we can get to.
So I would just add that we're in the midst of the audit of ESA as a whole, and we've issued the draft, and we're having an exit conference in a week. And so that would be another layer of broad broader recommendations that may help.
Ms. Duncan, the structural barrier, eliminating some of the structural barriers, those structural barriers are what again?
Well, I think it's what Dr. Smith alluded to earlier. There are some systemic barriers in place that potentially would make a big difference, but they're bigger issues to resolve. So within the framework in which we operate, I believe we're optimizing things as much as we can together.
Well, who knows? One of those may be one of the things that Mr. Mills brings us on the 29th and says, knock down that barrier. So we'll see. Okay. Thank you. Items 5.1 and 5.2 deal with the ticketing systems and ways that are recommended to improve those. And essentially, ISD's response is, well, ISD agrees that incidents and service requests should be captured in one ticketing system, but notes that email messages, which comprise the bulk of ISD service requests, frequently do not contain sufficient information to create a ticket. Ms. Duncan, you want to, and then goes on to say that you propose an alternative solution that involves creating a web portal that would streamline the collection of sufficient information to create tickets, and is also working to activate automatic information capture within the existing software. Do I understand that to mean, yeah, we agree that the existing system isn't optimal? Part of the reason for that is because when people send us an email, it rarely includes everything we need, so we ought to create a web portal where it's easy for people to give us everything we need. Is that what we're saying?
That's a fairly accurate statement. Accepting tickets via email is not sort of a best practice of how to do this. So we are implementing our new solution. Ms. Wallace's team is doing that, so I'll let her speak a little bit more to what they're doing and how it's going to work better.
Ms. Wallace?
So part of the recommendation was to do some documentation before we began the implementation, and that's exactly what has happened. There's been a group, it's actually an initiative led by our CTO, I'm sorry, acronyms, Chief Technology Officer, to document a lot of our workflows. And so the first workflow was called Detect to Correct. And that is primarily what we're talking about here when people have an incident and they were reaching out to the service desk. So that's now a very well documented process flow. So the next step is just to configure the software to do that. And part of that is we want it to be consistent across the county where there's multiple help desks. So we're having to reach out to other county departments that run small help desks as well. But we're in a good position to be able to capture the information and deal with these incidents in a consistent manner.
Okay. And then the next one was that 5.2 was prior to acquisition of a new ticketing system, revise current and ongoing ITS ticketing practices to track and report to management on additional tickets and other customer request data necessary to measure and constantly improve performance. ISD response was partially agreed. ISD agrees the importance of tracking and reporting ticket information, but also notes that since not all service requests are captured in the system, such tracking will necessarily be incomplete, so on and so forth. Sounds to me like what you're working on is designed to capture all of that. Did I get that right or no?
That is correct. And again, the ticketing system that we're using is probably something that similar to something you've experienced where you have used a service and immediately you get a survey that says, how did we do? And you can rank 4 stars, 5 stars, whatever. There's similar functionality in this tool so that when a ticket is closed, the system can be set to automate a survey question to the requester to immediately give feedback to how we did.
Let me turn to Ms. Sullivan. Ms. Sullivan, it sounds to me like we're making progress on these two, even if it's by a slightly different route. Are you feeling comfortable with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Then let's go to 5.3, which is the recommendation is to develop written procedures and required fields for ticket and other customer service request data entry, including standardized definitions for priority. ISD says partially agree the new ticketing system includes flexibility in creating definitions that can be adjusted to the needs of different departments. I don't understand what's going on here, so could somebody explain to me what's going on here? I think it's just outside my area of technical expertise and understanding.
So when this initiative began, one of the challenges was that we had service desks at social services, at the hospital, and at what was the traditional ISD. So in many cases, there were different approaches to how we escalated tickets, different terminology was being used. And one of the things that you see a reference to ITIL, which is the IT Infrastructure Library. And what that is it's a standard protocol that most IT organizations around the world use, and it's a standard methodology to dealing with service requests. And what we found was that we needed to train staff on ITIL so that everyone was speaking the same language. So this was beyond the need to just identify which boxes to put on the form. We needed to make sure that the technicians that were actually responding to the calls were all speaking the same language and following the same methodology. And so that was an important first step. So now that we have completed most of that training, there's still a few staff members that are actually in the training, but we completed that step, and we've also mapped out the processes. Then it's pretty simple once you're building the form to use common language.
And so what I'll sort of summarize, I think part of your question is, we only partially agreed because we had multiple service desks. Now we're in a position to consolidate our service desk, and we're actually agreeing with you and implementing your original recommendation.
Got it. Ms. Soloff, anything else on those?
Thank you.
Okay. That takes us to 5.7, 6.1, and 6.2. And Ms. Soloff, I'm going to turn to you in a minute, because what I'm going to say is I have read the audit recommendation. I have read the administrative response. I've read the current status, and it appears to me that these problems are, in fact, being satisfactorily addressed. Any concern based on the most recent update?
No.
All right. And I think, sometimes you get to the same good result with a slightly different path, and that's just fine. So I think we don't have, and I should remember this, do we need to take this on to the full board after we have an opportunity for Supervisor Chavez to look at it on the 29th? I don't believe we do, since it's just a one-year status report.
Right.
Okay. I don't think we want to go through this with 5 board members, but I know that Supervisor Chavez will care, as do I, and so let's bring this back on the 29th. My issues have been raised and responded to, so thank you. And the one issue that I'm likely to revisit is the issue with the CISO and how we make sure that those, to the county executive's good point, how those issues get addressed as opposed to focusing on simply filling the positions. Okay. All right. Then for this committee of the whole, I believe that is our final item for today. We will be back on the 29th when we hope to be at full strength. Thank you all very much. We're adjourned.